Hi, my name is Otis Hackney. Sorry I couldn't be there. I had a number of conflicts going on, but Mark, thank you for the opportunity to participate with those in the room and those across the country around this conversation, when we talk about schools as engineers for innovation and opportunity. So just quick background, I know you have some of it as Chief Education Officer here in the city of Philadelphia. I've been in education for over 20 years. I started off as a teacher. I was a math teacher. That's my background. I miss the classroom dearly. I still tell folks it's my favorite job. But then I moved into administration, and then now in the current role as Chief Education Officer for the city of Philadelphia. And what that means, depending on where you're from and what district you're representing or, what sector of education. So that is a role that it reports to the mayor of the city of Philadelphia, and the school district of Philadelphia and the city of Philadelphia are two very distinct organizations. The superintendent does not report to our mayor. He is one of our partners, and I'm a liaison between the mayor's office and anything that deals with education, but especially for this mayor in the K-12, well, actually I can say pre-K to 12 space. In the first term. We've now moved into our second term recently, and my work has shifted because in the first term, a good deal of my work was around establishing community schools, which I will take some questions on community schools and what we've done here in Philadelphia, to also locally funded, which was done with the beverage tax, and I can talk about that process as well if people have questions. And then another major thing we did in the first term in education was return our school district local control, because for about 20 years, the school board was under the state. There was what we call a School Reform Commission, SRC. So if you hear me say SRC at some point, that stands for the School Reform Commission, which was a 5-member commission where 3 members were appointed by the governor's office and had to be confirmed by our state legislators and then by the mayor. We returned to local control a little over a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now. And that was a big deal. And our board is appointed by the mayor. So it's a mayor appointee. So it's not an elected school board. We are the only district in the state of Pennsylvania that does not have an elected school board. It is by mayoral appointment, and that is according to our home rule charter, which are the laws that govern our city. So even if people wanted a home elected school board, it would take a bit of legislation on the local level to change that. So glad to take some questions on that as well as we think about this work. And lastly, before I get into just a couple talking points and take questions, is now that Mayor Kinney has been reelected, we are shifting to a focus on higher ed. So a big piece of now, like almost all of my work, in addition to working with the school district and around charters and everything, is we are developing some investments into our local community college. So we're working on how do we increase full-time enrollment at community college, the Community College of Philadelphia. And with that, helping with some last dollar to close tuition gaps after, whatever state and federal grants kick in, how to close that gap, but also look at into covering fees for students. And also human and social services that go along with that. So in terms of transportation, food insecurity, childcare, which I know enough about pre-K work to be a little bit dangerous, but I do not claim to be an expert. But how do we align those other services and look at additional challenges and barriers that negatively impact people from completing CCP, our community college, within 2 to 3 years. So that is a huge lift. So when I think about the work that I've done in the past 4+ years, and we're just into year 5, is really about how do we uplift those programs and then move forward. But the piece that got me here in this role was really around doing some things differently in the high school space. So immediately before this role, I was a high school principal. And I was a principal in 2 different schools before I had this role. One was a suburban school right outside Philadelphia, which was very different. And then the school before this role was a school, South Philadelphia High School, which is like a school, it's 100 years old, over 100 years old, I should say. And those of you, depending on your age or how well you know pop culture, from Frankie Avalon to Chubby Checker, or even going further back like Marian Anderson. So it has a very rich history, especially on pop culture and music as a school. But it was a school that was going through some pretty tumultuous times before I got there, and started to change and do some innovative things, or what was thought to be innovative for the city of Philadelphia. And the first thing that I would like to say around that was, just moving without fear. I can tell you that when I was in the principal in a suburban district, which was outside of Philadelphia, I was the first African-American principal of that in that district. But it was a small district, one of those districts where you have 2 elementary schools, 1 middle school, 1 high school. But it was definitely a shift for someone like me who grew up in Philadelphia and on a very different side of town, to be able to make that transition to a suburban school. And then, like I said earlier, immediately following that, going to South Philadelphia High School, which is a school for, just quickly, full Title I school. About 34% of my students were special ed IEP students. I had more than about 23% ELL students, and there wasn't a lot of overlap with those gaps because I had a very diverse school with about 22, 23 different languages. So we had a very high immigrant population. And so when I thought about the challenges of going to South Philadelphia High School, it was by law, more than 50% of my students required some type of instruction, in addition to just dealing with the issues around poverty and trauma. Most of like I said, the students who were born and raised in Philadelphia and attended South Philadelphia High School because of our high Title I numbers and free lunch numbers. And so going from a school from the burbs where I had water polo teams and to a school where you just have high poverty rates and high special needs and high ELL populations, had to really think about some approaches differently. Obviously, academics at the school were not at the highest level, but also there was little alignment of services. And so when I said earlier in terms of around fear, that was a job that very few people wanted to take in the city of Philadelphia because of, like I said, there were some issues between African-American students and Asian immigrant students that was pretty violent the year before. And so it was a school that a lot of people were afraid to take a chance on in terms of leadership. There was an agreement with the Department of Justice that the school was under for about 3 years. And people asked me, like, why would you, your comfortable suburban school with your water polo teams and golf carts to ride around the different campuses and different events, why would you leave that and take on a challenge like South Philadelphia High School? And so one was overcoming the factor, and 2, I was dumb enough and crazy enough to bet on myself and take a gamble. I think people who are really successful or innovative in certain spaces, you have to be willing to take a risk. And so I said, I'm young enough and have enough space, lead time to take a risk with my career. And so that was, a big motivating factor in me saying, okay, you know what, 1, I can't make it any worse, but 2, if I can make it better, it does improve outcomes or educational experience for children here in the city of Philadelphia. And so, so one of the things that I learned when I was at Springfield, and I was doing some restorative justice practices, restorative practices training, I learned a phrase that really stuck with me because I felt it just kind of captured my approach to teaching and learning from when I was a math teacher, was around high expectations, high support. So even if we want people to be, really innovative and create opportunities for students, there has to be a serious alignment around the expectations and supports for students. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do was set the tone for the school was really first, before I could address behavioral change out of the students, were looking at what are some of the behavioral changes of the adults that needed to happen in the building. So 1, when we think about expectations, what were the expectations that people, that the adults had for students in the building? How do we address that? But also, what are some of the supports that the adults need actually to, that align with the expectations that I was putting upon them? So that way, as we move forward with setting those new expectations for students, there was alignment. Another thing that I say all the time, and I picked this up from another professional development, I can't remember where, but it stuck with me, was always around having shared vocabulary with shared meaning. And so that was something that we focused on all the time. And so when I did talk about expectations, people were very clear for whatever issue we were or challenges we were facing, that we were very clear on the vocabulary and very clear on the meaning of what we wanted the expectation and how we wanted to align the supports. You know, in any high functioning organization, you know that vocabulary, they have a culture, they have certain aspects that when you say certain terms, everyone knows what they mean. You walk into a dysfunctional school and you know those things don't. And so how do you create innovative models in the school that is of high dysfunction? So first you just have to address some of the root causes. The other piece is around innovation and creating opportunity, which is having a mindset of that my students belonged in any space that other students in the city belonged in, especially in terms of like some of our higher performing magnet schools. One thing that I'm very proud of is just like, I had a 2-year run where I had 3 students that were Gates Millennial Scholars. No other school in the city could touch that. And they were like, how did you do that? And it was really creating, one, the expectations for teachers, what I wanted them to do, but around what I wanted the students to be able to do. And so teachers that were really willing to say, okay, you know what, I'm willing to raise the expectations. And me being very clear and resourceful about finding the supports that they needed in order to either obtain their goals, professional goals, or also and with alignment to how is this going to move the students forward. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in being so innovative for the students. The really, you know, the folks that are on the front line are the adults in the building. As a principal, it didn't take me long to realize, like, I don't teach a single class in this building, right? So in the city of Philadelphia, that's one thing you rarely get an opportunity to do. You have space and opportunity to teach. I would have loved to teach a class, but that wasn't possible. And so in order for, you know, my expectations of what I had as an educator to permeate the building was I had to set those clear parameters, but then make sure that I provided opportunity. And I have a number of sayings that people who work with me always mess with me about, but another thing that I say is you teach responsibility by giving it. And so for my teachers, it was, what was, you know, when I would meet with them one-on-one at the beginning of the year, what are you really trying to achieve? What resources do you need to do it? And then it's like, my thing is, if you get good results, and we don't lie, cheat, or steal, you know, we don't lie, cheat, or steal to get good results. How do we make sure that we can get those outcomes, and what resources? And then I told them, I said, and it's my role to find that. So being very, I think, resourceful as a principal is important, and then giving people a little space to make mistakes, to try things, to be innovative in the classroom, but as long as they were very clear about what they wanted students to do. And I say that as I transition into, like, when I think about the high expectations and high supports, I always focused on, with my educators, what do you want students to demonstrate, and how do you want to demonstrate? How do you want them to demonstrate what they've learned? Because as we think about education and how we move forward and progress in terms of, especially as things change from state to state, or here in the state of Pennsylvania around testing, because as I was principal there, the state test change. We had what was called a PSSA, which was a state performance, moved to, for the high schools, a Keystone, which now is a graduation requirement, a Keystone exam for students. So that was a huge shift. And so how do we make sure that we're very clear on what we want students and how we want to demonstrate what they've learned, so there's an alignment with what you taught, and being very clear about those expectations and working with students to make sure that those things happen. And so, with teachers to make sure those things happen. So that was a definite shift in culture for the staff, and really thinking about what are some other opportunities that we can create to be innovative in the school. And so it was, how do we approach teaching and learning? What are the things that you're thinking about doing? Where are the areas you think you're most proficient? And then what supports do you need to increase your proficiency level as a teacher? And those were the areas where I thought that we really made some serious changes in bringing in instructional coaches that were actually aligned to what the teachers wanted to do versus what I was told. And so it was great because I had an instructional coach who was not a school district employee. I had an instructional coach through a grant, and really working closely with that instructional coach around, this is the capacity of my staff, these are their strengths, this is the areas where I think we can develop them, and in concert with conversations that we had with them, and then focused on those areas And we saw tremendous growth at South Philadelphia High School, at least while I was there. Some things have changed a little bit, but we're still moving in the right direction. The other part of the supports was aligning and developing a community school model. So around the community school piece was just really, and it was based on what I saw a lot when I was in the suburbs, was when I was at a wealthier, I saw high expectations and ridiculously high levels of support. So whether it was the highest performing student or students that had the most struggles, the level of resources from counselors to social workers to just special ed supports that students had in a wealthy, it was amazing to me, and I thought it was fantastic. And then when I come back to South Philadelphia High School, I barely have half of what I had with a higher concentration of students with higher needs. And so I needed to figure out, how do I work with external partners to, one, address some of the issues, but also to create opportunities. And so how do you create innovative opportunities is utilizing the resources that we have as a city. Philadelphia is a fairly large city with a number of eds and meds, museums, and other organizations and nonprofits that can work in our school. And so bringing those partners to the table and aligning them around shared goals, which was a very laborious process, was something that we were able to do in terms of being very different here in the city of Philadelphia, which led to a really good opportunity to where I am today, is because of some of the things that we did around adopting a community school approach, because at the time the school district did not have community schools and really wasn't keen on the idea of community schools. But when our mayor was elected, our current mayor, that was one of the things that he and our city council president wanted to do, was adopt a community school model, because people were starting to see the results that we were getting at South Philadelphia High School. So we were making, at the time, AYP, we were making AYP, and we were also having, and not just in growth, but also the number of students in terms of increasing proficiency rates. We also saw suspensions go down, graduation rates go up. And it was really just thinking about, how do we align supports, but how do we raise expectations for students so that way they can compete. And the last piece, because I know like there are some questions, because I want to be mindful of time, and I know I've said a lot so far, is when we think about the opportunity component of education and what we're trying to do. And the way I talk about it, and I know some people, depending on where you fall in terms of academia or educational philosophy, it may be controversial, and yes, maybe not. But when I think about, as a person who grew up in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is a city with, out of all the large cities, we have by far the highest poverty rate. We're at 25% poverty rate here in the city of Philadelphia, which is by far the highest out of all the large cities. And so a lot of times I look at things through a poverty lens, because I also know about my upbringing and where I grew up and how I grew up and the opportunity that education has provided. And so when I think about, when students would ask me as a math teacher, why do I need to learn this? So you're teaching quadratic equations and students are like, why do you need to learn this? And you give them, a traditional teacher response, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it's a very positive thing, or it could be negative. But over time, it's separating out, for students, especially those growing up in poverty, foundational skill versus marketable skill. And so when I would talk to students, especially as I came in leadership, and you get out of the bubble of the classroom, because the classroom is a very interesting space to be in. And then when you come out of it, you just get a very different view of schools. And as I moved out, my view around a number of things changed. But when I think about foundational skills versus marketable skills, and when we think about students that we may struggle with the most, and I can even say, even in the burbs, because you would have students who are just like, why do I need to do this if I'm going to do X? So, and having really explicit and blunt conversations with students around why it's important to have these foundational skills, which puts you on a pathway to marketable skills. With students, especially coming out of poverty, they're trying to look for exit ramps off of this poverty pipeline to that highway that gets you into, how do you access generational wealth? And those are hard conversations for people who have always, one, been in generational poverty, and do they have enough imagination to see themselves on a pathway to generational wealth? So having conversations with them as we look at being innovative and looking for opportunities for students is something very simple that I would say to students. I said, okay, your goal is, as you go through, whether it be a foundational skill or marketable skill, is one is, any foundational skill or most foundational skills can be translated into a marketable skill, and unpacking that for a student. So, you know, we talk about, especially now currently when we talk about develop agency within students, but we don't talk explicitly about, well, what does that really mean and what pathway does that put me on? So I would say to students that your job is to obtain a marketable skill, something that someone will pay you. You have, you know, acquire a skill, put you on a pathway where someone will pay you and hopefully a meaningful wage to do it. And then, is it transferable? As we know, especially with young folks today, the job that they start coming out of high school or out of college will not be the job that they retire with. And so is it are these transferable skills? So how do your foundational skills support you being able to, one, getting paid with a marketable skill, and do you have enough of a foundation for it to be transferable? And then as you move up and mature, hopefully that it becomes scalable. I think about my pathway from a teacher to a principal to now, you know, chief education officer. I had to reflect a lot on the marketable aspect of what I know in terms of my professional skill set, transferring over to city government, which would take forever to unpack, and I can't do that in an hour. Being an educator to now being someone on the policy side at the local level, to now to, is it scalable? Say, doing one community school when I was a principal, to how does that translate to developing over 20 community schools here across the city? And so, but when you talk to students about whatever interest they're in, how do they think? But also more importantly, when you talk to teachers about thinking about that approach, as they think about their teaching and learning with students, it does inform how they think, especially those who are very innovative, of wait a minute, okay, how does, as an English teacher, you know, we have the basics of what we want students to do, but how does that really translate into communication skills? And are you really explicit with students about why reading and writing and in terms of and public speaking are those strong communication skills, and how they lead to a marketable skill and transferable to other areas, especially if you tie that in with some other expertise. And so I think it's people getting mindsets around why do we teach today versus historically, the purpose of education, because things have really shifted. How students believe they can move forward and acquire wealth is very different now in terms of digital platforms and social media. And so it's really, what are the marketable skills that you need to be successful, especially for students when it comes to breaking generational poverty and moving them into a pathway to generational wealth. And so I don't mind taking that very pragmatic approach to teaching and learning, or how I think and around it. For, you know, those that have studied, you know, Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, you know, there was this ongoing conversation around the talented 10th, or really thinking about what are the basic skills that people need in order to just survive. And I don't think that that is a binary conversation. That is something that when we think about individuals, you know, do we create environments so that way our highest performing students have opportunities and they see their pathways, or to our students who just said, know what, I see another pathway moving forward, but this is a marketable skill that puts me on a different trajectory in my life. And how do we as educators make sure that we're creating those varied pathways for students that doesn't set up one versus the other? Here over on the West Coast, I mean, on the East Coast here in Philadelphia, you know, one of the big things to do is to go to the Jersey Shore. And I always jokingly say, there's a lot of plumbers who have nice houses at the Jersey Shore who are from Philadelphia. And people have to understand that when we think about students and how we move them out of certain spaces into new spaces, it is very honoring, I think, those marketable skills and the importance of it, but still it doesn't lessen the value of the foundational piece. And I think if we were more explicit about that, I think that would be a huge shift, because I can say that at South Philadelphia High School when I was there, I saw a huge shift in how teachers approached it, and actually how students understood this is why it's important for us to have these basic skills, because and how they translate into something that can be marketable, or put you on the pathway to a marketable skill. And even when I've talked to people in academia, I just say, hey, look, being an academic, that's a marketable skill. Someone or university will pay you well for the skill set that you have developed over these years. And so it doesn't remove one group from the other. It doesn't lessen the value of learning for learning's sake, or the value of research or teaching at higher ed. I think it honors multiple pathways in terms of for students to see the opportunities that are presented to them. And so You know, like I said, I want to save some time for questions because I know when Mark asked me to do the presentation, we wanted to do, you know, about 20, 30 minutes for questions. And I know I put a lot on the table, especially around from local control to beverage taxes to schools to pre-K. I just wanted to be able to share a little bit with what we're doing, and but also what drives me in terms of the work that I've done here in the city of Philadelphia and how we're just trying to build upon that, but in partnership with a great mayor. They call him the education mayor, so which just makes my job that much harder as a chief education officer. But really just wanted to, you know, take this opportunity to just share and, you know, and like I said, at this point, take some questions around anything that I've shared with you today.